Hello, everyone. I want to begin by thanking Ramanujan College, Shipra, and her entire team for giving me this opportunity. Um, I would be talking today to you on the theme authoritative texts and pedagogic research. At the onset, let me lay out the framework for the discussion today, and then we'll get into the specifics of each of the pointers. I want to begin by introducing the idea of quote unquote authoritative texts to us. And this would also entail defining what an authoritative text is, or how does one ground the idea of an authoritative text. Thereafter, we'll proceed to discuss an illustration of the authoritative text. What are the areas in which one can witness the presence of authoritative texts? And then we'll proceed with a discussion in a particular area in which authoritative text as an idea exists, which is the discipline of law. And after one has um, laid down the ground for defining an authoritative text, we'll try and, in the second half of the lecture, problematize the idea of authoritative text by bringing in examples from real life, scholarships that have engaged with real life examples. To problematize the idea of authoritative text. But let me begin by placing the theme for today in context of the workshop or the refresher course that we're all part of. Why is it that the idea of an authoritative text should form a part of a pedagogic session? Precisely because anything that claims to represent an authority claims to have a certain objectivity woven around it. It's precisely this claim of objectivity attached or affixed to texts, documents, I'm using the word texts here, which becomes a problematic for the discipline of social science. Because it's not that social science cannot have the concept of objectivity. There's, of course, a presence of objectivity in social science. But how objective is the idea of objectivity in social science is always a problematic. Now, when we look at the idea of authoritative text that seems to represent a certain totalizing narrative through it, it becomes a problem area for social science. Because if we claim to work with world as an interpretation, then one cannot work with the idea of texts claiming objectivity. And that's the premise with which I am trying to proceed with today's discussion. Um, the if I have to formulate the problematic for today's session, it would be this. How do texts that claim an objective character present a totalizing truth? And how can that totalizing truth be deconstructed using methods of social sciences? This is precisely the formulation of the problematic for today. Now, like I said, I would be looking at a particular area in which the presence of authoritative text is felt, and that's the discipline of law. However, a lot of what we would be discussing today can apply to religious texts as well. But it's probably for you to take the learnings of this lesson of this session and then apply it to the domain of religion and see if some of the premises that we are going to be placing today are applicable to the domain of religion or not. Um, what is it that the idea of the authoritative text entails? Um, all my examples are going to be from India. I would be referring to scholars who are Western, but their work that would be discussed today are all work done on the Indian society. This is the Indian Constitution. A very lay example of an authoritative text would be the Constitution of India. Why is it an authoritative text is something that we'll come to. But let me introduce a particular section from the Constitution to you. This is Article 394A, which actually defines what authoritative text is by actually not confining it to a definition, but through the introduction of the idea. Article 394A of the Indian Constitution is the provision related to authoritative text in the Hindi language. What does it say? It says the president shall cause to be published under his authority the translation of this constitution in the Hindi language, and then there are other clauses attached to it. There's the clause number 3 that I'm interested in. The translation of this constitution and of every amendment thereof, published under this article, shall be deemed to be for all purposes the authoritative text thereof in the Hindi language. Basically, saying that the translation of the constitution in Hindi under the authority of this particular article of the constitution authorized by the president of India, that particular translation will be considered as the authoritative text of the constitution in Hindi. So that would be the authoritative text known as the Samvidhan, Bharat ka Samvidhan. Now, what is this idea of authority affixed to the translation of the text, which can claim authority only through the provision of the Constitution and under the supervision of the President? It's this idea of a certain force behind the text that I am interested in looking at. If we look at the Official Language Act 1963 in India, it also provides for, it lays down provisions for translation of acts, order, regulation, etc., which are to be published under the authority of the president in different languages, and they are deemed to be authoritative texts. So again, there is this idea of the force behind a particular text, which makes it the authoritative text. Now, it's not that the authoritative texts are immune to criticisms. We may engage with the authoritative texts in the most critical, brutally critical manner. But what we cannot deny is the fact that these texts represent an authority in the sense that they do not just describe the world. They do not just describe the things that they are talking about. They constitute a state of affairs. They bring about a state of affairs. They are declaratory in nature, which means that they pronounce things in a manner that their pronouncement constitutes reality. There is no escape from the reality. We may detest that reality, we may be critical of that reality, but we cannot escape that reality. That's the idea of the authoritative text that I am looking at. And like I said in the beginning, social science should have objection to this kind of confinement that the idea of authoritative texts embody or import. Laws in general are believed to be authoritative texts. Um, Thomas Hobbes in his uh, a dialogue between philosopher and student of common law in England had famously remarked that it is not wisdom that makes law, but authority that makes law. What is this idea of authority connected to law that creates authoritative texts? Now, the purpose of every text is communication. One of the purposes, at least, of every text is communication. It can simply be expression. One can say that I'm writing something just because I want to express and I do not necessarily want to communicate. But whenever there is a mutuality to the text, the purpose of expression translates into communication. So the purpose of any text would be communication. Now, as compared to other texts which are not written, which are non-written expressions, oral, or other forms of graphic representations, conventionally become vulnerable to interpretation much more than written texts do. Written text conventionally was supposed to be the most uh, traditional idea of communication, where the meaning of the communication was bound to the written text. The modern legal order works on this particular assumption of the written text. But in social science, like, we know that no particular communication is objective, in the sense that the meaning that the author is trying to convey is not necessarily the meaning that the reader elicits out of the text. But the claim of written communication with which the modern legal order proceeds is different from this kind of gap in meaning or lag in meaning between the intention of the author and the interpretation or the understanding of the reader. Modern legal order defies this kind of gap. It resists the idea of polysemy, which is multiple meanings. Why? Because laws can only be abided by if they represent uniform command. So, legal communication always resists the idea of polysemy. Now, if legal texts try to bind themselves to authoritative texts, then what are the characteristics of authoritative texts that legal language or legal communication creates? What are the things characteristic of authoritative texts, or how do we, what does it entail to be an authoritative text? And there are a couple of points that one can um, think about. The first is meaning essentialism, that the meaning that is being conveyed in the text is an essentialized meaning. It's not a meaning that can be interpreted in multiple ways. There is a fixed idea that is contained in the text. The second, that particular meaning, the second is connected to the first point. That particular meaning which has been essentialized is not, the source of that meaning is not external to the text. The source of the meaning is internal to the text, which means that the meaning essentialism is produced in the text itself. Which means, if you look at the language of law, it always provides for what a particular word means in in this particular context. That's the idea of language meaning essentialism bound to the text. The third is the idea of a uniform command. Authoritative texts present with uniform commands. Fourth is the idea of an internal perspective. What is this internal perspective? It's the idea of the method that the text embodies, which means that the way in which you perceive the text, the method of engaging the text, is not external to the discipline, is not external to the source of the text. It is internal to the discipline which has created the text. So, for example, if you're reading the statute, the method that you employ to read the statute are methods of statutory interpretation, which are inherent and intrinsic and internal to the discipline of law. It's not something that comes from other disciplines, it's internal, it's an internal perspective. And a fifth point, which is related to all the others, but particularly related to the fourth point, is the idea of autonomy. That because these texts claim a certain totalizing tendency, and because they only allow for internal perspectives to emerge, there is a certain autonomy that these texts claim from the rest of the society, from the rest of the world. If you have to translate it into a particular approach in the discipline of law, it would translate into the doctrinal approach to law. The doctrinal approach to law, which is engaging with law only strictly through legal rules, statutes, judgments, all the texts that are inherently legal in nature. It's this engagement to the study of law that produces the doctrinal approach. Now, doctrinal approach is an example of producing authoritative texts which are bound by meanings produced by the text, which have a method that are inherently internal to the discipline, and because of these points it claims to have a certain autonomy from the rest of the world. That's the idea of autonomy that the discipline of law claims to present with. That law as a discipline is autonomous, and even though law is part of the society, it stands at a distance from the society, which is why it claims to govern the society. That's the objective idea of how law is placed in the society. We will now try to problematize this assumption and see how a doctrinal approach to law, an inherently autonomous, objective approach to law, does disservice to a comprehensive understanding of law. And in social sciences and humanities, if we are engaging with law, which is inevitable because law is present as part of our everyday, we are engaging with law on an everyday basis. If we are engaging with law, then what are the methods that we apply to engage with law? That's the discussion that we are now going to have. I'm choosing 4 particular questions to branch out the discussion. These 4 particular questions are 4 different ways in which one can engage with law. The first is a descriptive question, which is the question of how does the law read? Mind you, the descriptive question is not what is law. What is law is a more constitutive question that we'll look at later. The descriptive question is how do you describe law, which means the question is how does law read? The second question is a normative question, which is the question of how ought the law read? How should the law read? It's a normative question in which there is a certain expectation from law to fulfill certain ideals. So the law should read in a certain way, which is linked to the larger purpose of law, etc., etc. The third is the question of what are the consequences of law. We could also translate it as the question of the effects of law. In social sciences, we also translate this question as the question of instrumentality, an instrumentalist reading of law. What are the ways in which law affects the society? And what are the ways in which law can be used in society? So, an instrumentalist reading of law. And fourth is the question, which is the most important question, which is a constitutive question of what is law, and a more complicated question also. Now, if we stick to the doctrinal approach alone, which is, like I said, the approach that throws up the idea of authoritative text, which claims that legal texts are authoritative in nature, they constitute reality, they 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 have a method which is inherently internal, and the engagement, the scope of engagement that they allow are autonomous to the discipline of law. They are not external to the discipline of law. Now, if we apply this particular method to look at the 4 questions, the answers would be very different from the kind of answers that we would get if we apply external perspectives. So, we'll come to the external perspectives later. Let's try and understand how the internal perspective of law will approach these 4 questions. So, going back to the question of the description, how does law read? A doctrinal approach would look at the appearance, the black letter approach, which is called. What is the text in terms of a strict textualist reading say about the law? That's the black letter approach, descriptive approach to law. Normative. Normative can be reduced to a positivist, legal positivism, a positivist understanding of law. It can also be linked to the natural law tradition, which is the question of what should law read, or sorry, what should the law look like, or how should the law read. Now, it's linked to the purpose of law, the ideals of law. In the positivist tradition, the law should represent a certain procedural idea. There is a certain procedural grounding of law. So, how should the law read as as the procedures define it? In the natural law tradition, there is a certain idea of natural law, which provides for natural principle of justice, which embodies the idea of due process, say in the American Constitution, believes in this kind of idealist in this kind of teleological reading of law. What is the purpose to which law should work? Due process, natural principles of justice, towards attaining natural principles of justice, etc. So, in this particular framework, the normative question of how should the law read would translate in accordance with the expectations of law in the natural principles of justice. The law should read as the natural principles of justice would expect the law to read. So, the law should embody the idea of these natural principles. The third is the instrumentalist, or the idea of the effects of law, consequences of law. If you apply a purely doctrinal approach, then this would translate into an empirical question. Now, there's a difference between empiricism and empirical. Empiricism would mean that there is an overt reliance on facts, statistics. Empirical would mean anything that is to do with the lived reality, anything that is real, that is experiential. An empirical understanding of law through a doctrinal approach would look at the consequences of the doctrine, the consequence of the statute, the consequence of the judgment, as is intended in that particular text. For example, and I will take examples that I would actually further elaborate through the sociological cases. For example, 377. So, a doctrinal approach to Section 377, which criminalized homosexuality until the Supreme Court judgment. If the doctrinal approach looks at the effect, the instrumental reading of Section 377 and the judgment that decriminalized it, it would look at the effect of the judgment. So, what is the effect of the judgment? The effect of the judgment is that it has decriminalized homosexuality in the society. So, it looks at the intended effect. That's the instrumentalist reading. So law is an instrument towards certain ends. In this case probably social change, in this case probably upholding the constitutional values of equality, dignity, etc. And how is that effect to be gauged? In the intention of the text itself. And then finally, the fourth, what is law? Constitutive question. The doctrinal approach is particularly scarce when it comes to defining the constitutive question, which is what is law? Because the doctrinal approach in defining what is law goes back to the first question, which is about the description of law. What is law? It is what the law describes. There is no constitutive world in which the doctrinal approach can place law. And hence, the fourth question always remains an inadequate question in the internal perspective paradigm. And for the fourth question, one actually turns to the idea of law in social sciences. So now we move to the second part of the lecture where we look at the discipline of social science and how social science's engagement with the authoritative text, in this case, the legal texts, as I said in the beginning, will open up the idea of the legal text. Will, if you go back to the five meanings that we had assigned to the authoritative text, we'll see that a social science understanding of authoritative text de- uh, uh, problematizes each of the five meanings, each of the five characteristics. Let's recount the five characteristics again and then proceed with the real life stories to see how the five characteristics are problematized. The first is language essentialism. So, social science would actually be able to show how authoritative texts, despite their claim that there is a fixed meaning to the words that they use, social sciences would show that these meanings change as they travel. So, when law interacts with ground actors, these meanings begin to get deconstructed. The second, the idea of meanings being bound to legal texts, that again is problematized on the ground that when meanings begin to change, when meanings begin to travel, they are no longer bound to the authoritative text. Meanings acquire a life of their own outside of the text. And if they acquire a life of their own outside the text, they carry law out of the text. They carry the meaning of law out of the text. The third, the nature of uniform command, which is, of course, demolished in the light of the first two. If meanings cannot be essentialized and meanings cannot be confined to what the text is saying, there is no uniform command that the meanings can convey. Fourth, internal perspective, of course not, because if none of the first three are being fulfilled, then the approach that you are employing towards understanding law is no longer internal to it. You are applying an external perspective to law, which is not the doctrinal approach, but which is a more social science based approach. I was going to say sociological approach, but law and society is only one of the approaches. There are various approaches that different disciplines has thrown. Like law and economics is a very dominant movement which tries to apply an economics perspective to understand the working of the law, the meaning of law, the intention of law, so on and so forth. And finally, the claim of autonomy of law, autonomy of authoritative texts. Now, the autonomy of the authoritative texts was grounded on the idea of the method of understanding the text being specific to the discipline. If that is no longer the case, authoritative texts can no longer claim to be autonomous. In fact, they become embedded in the world in which they operate. With this, I try and now move to the external perspective. Now, in the external perspective, if we recount the four questions descriptive, normative, instrumentalist, and constitutive, it's the last two, the third and the fourth, the instrumentalist and the constitutive, that acquire salience. It's not that the descriptive question is not important to social sciences or the normative question is not important to social sciences, but the real interface between law and society is seen in the instrumentalist and the constitutive question. What are the instrumentalist and constitutive questions in the social science paradigm through its engagement with law is something that we are now going to look at. Uh, Austin Sarath, a very eminent political scientist and legal philosopher, he had described two methods of engagement with law, and he had come up with these two views on law: instrumentalist view of law and constitutive. Now, the bifurcation is not his alone. There are many scholarships that have relied on this particular distinction between uh, uh, distinction of two different approaches of looking at law. But the definition of the instrumentalist and the constitutive that I'm going to rely on for today's discussion is borrowed from Austin Sarath, and I'm going to read out that bit. The instrumentalists Like the constitutives, both the instrumentalist view and the constitutive view are interested in understanding the relationship between law and society. But the thing that they are trying to gauge is slightly different. What is it that the instrumentalists are trying to gauge and understand? Law's capacity to regulate social relations. So, what is it, or what is the end towards which law is used, is an instrumentalist question. The constitutives, on the other hand, are interested in tracking what Austin Sarat calls the traces left by law on social relations. What does it mean? One is about regulating social relations, so ordering the society, and the second is about law leaving traces on social relations, which means the manner in which law operates, the manner in which law works, it leaves certain traces on the society in a manner in which it reconstitutes the society, and in turn it gets reconstituted itself. So a constitutive approach to looking at law and society would look at how law not just regulates the society but constitutes society, and in the process of constituting society, constituting social relations, it gets constituted through that engagement by itself. The instrumentalist view is committed to a strict division between legal rules and customs and habits, since law is distinguished in this view from other rules and norms operative in society by virtue of the fact that the former derive their authority from the state, while the source of the latter are smaller groups in the society. So there is a clear separation between legal rules and customs, etc., which are considered to be non legalistic unless they have the status of law. The constitutive view, on the other hand, looks at not how law is not, on the constitutive side, law is not experienced as episodic, artificial. It is not simply a set of rules that impinges on us from the outside. Rather, they look at law's constitutive power to shape social relations in a way that its own traces are erased in the very process of creating persons as legal subjects. So, when law in the constitutive framework tries to constitute legal subjects, its own traces are erased, while at the same time it leaves traces in the society. It's a complex argument. When law and society interact, there are ways in which law leaves its traces in the society. But those traces which are left in the society are left in a manner that these traces can no longer be recognized as traces of law. They become part of the social. And with this particular understanding, the constitutive view, I am now moving to some of the examples that I was going to discuss. The first example that I'm going to take up is coming from the work of Julia Eckert. Julia Eckert is an anthropologist who's worked on India. And the case study from her that I'm going to take up today is a case study that she had done in the slums of Dharavi, Bombay in the early 2000s. And there's one particular story that I'm going to take up from that particular fieldwork of hers. She is looking at the concept of rumor, afwah, the concept of rumor, and how rumors related to law shape the understanding of law in the eyes of the people. And it is through this understanding of the law, which is a rumored understanding of law, people's perception towards the legal system is constituted in a way that favors their struggle for rights. So, how a rumor about a law can create a rights discourse is an argument that she's trying to put forward. Now, what are the things that she's trying to say? She's saying you have to look at rumors as not just mischiefs or fragments of untruth or claims not backed by knowledge, but one has to look at rumors as creative interpretations of the news in which meaning making is taking place. So one is not talking about disinformation. There is a difference between rumor and disinformation. Disinformation is when you deliberately and maliciously spread incorrect news. A rumor is different from disinformation. Rumors are inadvertent. If they're inadvertent, they're not rumors. She's borrowing that particular concept of rumor. A rumor is inadvertent, it's something that spreads on its own, spontaneously, and it involves itself in the process of meaning making. There are meanings that are derived out of those rumors. What is the rumor that she is referring to? So she is looking at a particular case in which there's a couple, Amrita and Vikram, who had got married in 2001. And probably a year after marriage, Vikram wanted to divorce Amrita on the ground that she was mentally ill and the marriage had never been consummated. Now, the story is not that of Amrita's, but Amrita's mother, Tara, who wants the security of her daughter at all cost. So she agrees to the separation, she agrees to the divorce, not because Vikram wants the divorce, but because she thinks that her daughter will be harmed if she continues to stay in the marriage. So her preoccupation in the beginning is her daughter's security. She wants separation so that her daughter is safe and secure, even if that means being out of the marriage. But she insists that if her daughter is returning home, she should also lay her claims on the Stridhan dowry that was paid at the time of marriage. So at this point, there are two particular demands that she has, and she's not necessarily formulating them as demands. First is that her daughter should be safe, and second, that daughter's property should remain with her, should not be left with Vikram. Now, what are the ways in which she tries to further this struggle to ensure that her daughter's rights are not harmed? So she gets the neighbors into the matter, she gets the local pradhan into the matter, all of those things. And she insists that Vikram gives the money back, returns the money. And Vikram refuses to do that. But all this while, as all of these things are happening, Tara begins to have conversation on the process of divorce with several people in the vicinity, with some NGOs, with some people who work with legal aid, etc., etc. And at one point of time, she comes with a particular formulated demand in front of Vikram and says that she no longer is interested only in her daughter's return of Stridhan, but she also wants Vikram additionally to pay maintenance, alimony. Now, what has led to the transformation from Tara wanting just her daughter's security and at the most the return of Stridhan to actually asking for alimony? Now, asking for alimony is proactively exercising one's right. Now, what has led to this transformation? And Eckhart tries to explain this transformation through a rumor of right. What is that rumor of right? I'm going to read out parts of this particular story so that it's easier for you to capture the essence of it. Tara said, somebody, and please look at the language, carefully the language, someone, quote unquote, had told her that the Supreme Court had awarded a Muslim woman a large settlement that was to be paid to her by her husband who had divorced her. If a Muslim woman could get this, then surely it was also Amrita's right. Everyone knew that Muslim women had at least as hard a lot as themselves. So everything about the story is evasive. How does Tara get to know about this? No one knows. She does not even know the case, but from our understanding of the Indian politics, we know that she is referring to the Shahbanu case, 1985, where a Muslim woman was ordered by the Supreme Court, where the man was ordered by the Supreme Court to pay alimony to the wife. Tara has heard only parts of the story, which is what the Supreme Court did. Tara is unaware of the fact that a lot transpired after the judgment, that the Rajiv Gandhi government actually passed a law to overturn the decision of the Supreme Court. All of these things is Tara completely unaware of. She only knows that there is a relief available to people or to women particularly if they are being divorced, and it is a relief that the Supreme Court has made available to them. Now Tara is planning to write to the Supreme Court. What does she say? I am planning to write to the Supreme Court because I have heard that one can write to Supreme Court and tell of their plight. Now again, an evasive idea. She has heard from again some source that one can write to Supreme Court about their plight. This is another rumor, which is perhaps more true than the Shahbano case, which is about the idea of the PIL, that one could actually post through a postcard the petition, the public interest litigation on behalf of anybody. Now, this is another rumor of the law that she's heard. But putting these two together, half story from the Shahbano case and perhaps some idea of what a public interest litigation means, although having no conception of a PIL, she threatens Vikram with steps that are going to result into some sort of penal action against him. Now, Eckert, while she is, and this is not the only story that Eckert is relying on, she also relies on a couple of more. But through these stories, Eckert is not trying to show that a social engagement with law or society's engagement of law is always telling of possibilities. No. It may not always result in a successful struggle, but what it does is to transform passivity into an active discourse of rights. So, from being completely vulnerable to the situation in which Tara and Amrita felt or witnessed themselves, to transforming it into a struggle for rights, into a into an active negotiation in which they are being able to pressurize the other party, is facilitated only because of these half baked truths about legal documents that they have known. Now, if we go back to the idea of authoritative text through this story, what does one understand? The Shahbanu judgment was one particular authoritative text, which nowhere provided for the kind of inference that a Hindu woman, Amrita, could make out of that case. But it's the perception of the ground actor of that particular authoritative text, which has been taken out of context and new meanings have been attached to that particular text. It's that perception of the ground actor which has resulted in a whole new discourse of rights. That's the way in which social sciences can lead to problematizing the claim to objectivity of authoritative texts. I'm going to take another example, and this is through work done by a group of lawyers in the alternative law forum in Bangalore in the aftermath of decriminalization of Section 377 by the Delhi High Court in the Naz Foundation case. This was the first attempt at decriminalization by the Delhi High Court, which was overturned by the Supreme Court. And eventually, the Supreme Court overturned its own decision and decided that homosexuality is no longer going to be a crime. But that took an entire period. We are referring to the first premise in this entire trajectory of 377, which is when Delhi High Court had struck 377 down on the grounds that is violative of fundamental rights of the homosexuals. Now, what did the judgment do? The judgment plainly only decriminalized 377. A doctrinal approach which employs an internal perspective, an internal method of looking at law, would look at Section 377 for what it represents, that Section 377 only criminalized homosexuality. Homosexuality, in the sense, it criminalized carnal sexual relationship between people of same sex. That's all. In this idea of 377, a purely statutory reading of 377, there are no linkages that can be made to what would relationship such as marital relationships, such as live in relationships, etc., would mean for a homosexual couple. So, the effect of law in the doctrinal understanding of 377 would mean only this much, that sex between people of the same couple is a crime. It has no, in its intended understanding, has no bearing on the idea of life for the homosexual people, whether they can get married, etc., etc. Because if one says that one is married but not engaging in a sexual relationship, 377 would have no bearing on that kind of a relationship. Then cut to the judgment which decriminalizes homosexuality. Again, a purely doctrinal a doctrinal understanding of the judgment would say that after the pronouncement of this judgment, homosexuality has been decriminalized. So, sex between people of same sex is no longer a crime. Now, it no way gives them a license to engage in any kind of relationship if they belong to the same sex. It no longer legalizes their marriage, etc. It has no bearing on those things. It's only when you look at the constitutive view of law, how law constitutes social relations outside of its doctrinal approach, that you begin to see the effects of law in a different light. The effects of law not just being regulatory, but constitutive of new realities. How? And the lawyers in the ALF had done some field work and they'd come up with how the gay couples, the lesbian couples, began to perceive their life differently after the passing of this judgment. I am going to take three examples. First is a very generic example in which the homosexual, a person who's homosexual is saying that homosexuality became a normal conversation on the dining table with the parents, even though the parents were always aware that the person was homosexual, but it was still a forbidden conversation. But that's something that is more telling of the culture that the law creates, less about the kind of direct constitutive impact of law on social relations. But the other two examples that I'm taking have direct bearing on for the constitutive role of law. The first is that after the judgment had pronounced, people had started to get a lot of petitions for marriages among homosexual couples. Now, the judgment had said nothing about marriage. There was no policy, there was no act laid down for marriage among people of the same sex, in under which kind of marital act, would they be covered, etc. These were questions that the judgment was absolutely silent on. But it's the interpretation of the homosexual couples, the subject of this particular law, that now empowers them to have a conception of life based on the judgment which has decriminalized a part of their existence. Now, this is how the doctrinal approach is being transformed into a constitutive approach to law. The second example, in which a gay man is recounting an experience wherein his laptop had been stolen. And this is after the decriminalization of homosexuality, and he'd lodged a complaint at the police station. Ordinarily, if the police was aware of the fact that the person lodging a complaint was a homosexual, the police already worked on the assumption that it is a criminal category who is using the law. So, if you were a homosexual, whether or not you're engaging in the same sex act, you were already labeled as a criminal. You were part of a criminal category. So, your right to lodge a police complaint was next to non existent. But after the decriminalization of homosexuality, it's not that the mind of the police person has changed, the mentality has changed. No. And he says that it was with great reluctance that he agreed to lodge a complaint only after the person asserted his right that he's no longer a criminal in the eyes of the law and he has all the right to lodge the complaint. That the police person actually reluctantly agreed that, yeah, whatever you do in your home is none of my business, now that the law has also sanctified it. But just look at how the perceptions are changing. It's not that a homosexual did not have the right to lodge a complaint. Even if you are a criminal, a convicted criminal, you still have the right to go and lodge a complaint against your rights violation. But even your own perception about yourself is shaped by how the law perceives you. So if a part of your existence is criminalized, you yourself start to look at a part of your existence as criminal, hence you bearing the concept of criminality. Which is why the gay person himself says that he could rightfully assert his position in front of the police officer because the Supreme Court had allowed him to do so. And of course, the behavior of the police is so telling that it does not even need an explanation. Now, these are again examples of what a limited doctrinal approach, a confined doctrinal approach to authoritative texts cannot really arrive at. It's only when you apply a constitutive understanding of law and society, the relationship between the two, that you arrive at these conclusions. What has happened to the idea of the authoritative text in all of this? If authoritative texts were those that claimed language meaning essentialism, that could be read only in a manner that produced uniform commands, all of those claims seem to have completely diminished when one has applied a scientist and social scientist's view of law, or a constitutive view of the relationship between law and society, which means that the idea of an authoritative text is no longer really the gospel for social sciences to work with. If you employ the method of social sciences, and these are all methods of social sciences, one is doing ethnography, one is engaging with how uh, law serves an ethnographic function, how when law traverses ground, when it comes to the field, it undergoes transformation in its own meanings. And the manner in which people interpret the law, they defeat the idea of law being confined to one particular meaning, law being confined to one particular sense, which is coming from the doctrinal approach. This, however, is not always facilitative of the struggle of rights, which means that this kind of an anthropological function that law serves, the manner in which law changes in its interaction with the society, is not always towards the benefit of the ground actors. And this is something that we see when we look at how the state officials themselves interpret law that take it outside of its doctrinal existence. One can look at the cases of misapplication of law. One can look at what is termed as cases of misuse of law, in which you see that the section that is being invoked in an FIR or that is being cited by the police does not really provide for what the police is trying to do in that particular case. Whether we look at this only as misuse of law or we look at through a social science lens as also ways in which the state officials representing the state themselves also engage in the process of meaning making that demolish the authority of quote unquote the authoritative text is up to us. But I would continue with the discussion on how the ground actor's deception of the law actually creates more space for a democratic interpretation of law. So far, we had looked at cases in which state or the officials of the state had really no role to play. It was really the agency of the actors that was credited for an alternate meaning of the law. Now I'm looking at another set of case in which it appears that the state itself is willing to go beyond the legal mandate, beyond what can be prescribed by law. And to do this, I am relying on um, Veena Das's work. Veena Das, again, a very eminent anthropologist. And this is her fieldwork in the district of Noida, Gautam Buddha Nagar, which she had done again in early 2000s. And she's looking at a slum dwelling in Noida, which had about 350 odd families and a pradhan called Nathuram. And the struggle of the pradhan, Nathuram, to get some kind of semi permanent right to residence of these slum dwellers in Noida. Now, slums are an existing reality, we all know. But slums are as contingent as the reality itself is, which means that even though slums exist as real, and the existence of one's existence in the slum life is as real, it is as contingent and as episodic and sporadic as it can get, which means that it can be next to non existent in the very next moment in which it is existent. It's that kind of contingency which defines the life in slum, thanks to the legal orders of demolition or slum eviction. So she's talking about these 350 odd jhugis who have been served a demolition notice, an eviction notice, which is to be followed by a demolition, because they are living on what are called kabza lands, unclaimed lands. So kabza lands are not lands in which you uh, occupy forcefully, as the word signifies kabza. It's the local in the local parlance it's used as kabza, but kabza is just occupying that land which is lying vacant, and you build a settlement which is semi permanent or temporary, and you reside with certain facilitation from the state. Now, this idea of certain facilitation from state is interesting. Why? Because on the one hand, it is quote unquote kabza land, which means it is illegal and you're not supposed to be there. On the other hand, it is the state which allows you to do it, which means that the state is going against its own legal mandate. It is not, if it is illegal, it's not something that the state can claim an attachment to. But in reality, the state does claim an attachment to acts that are illegal, quote or slash extra legal. How is something that is exemplified in this particular case? Now, Veena Das is looking at the struggle of the Pradhan Nathuram to get some proof of residence for the Jhogi settlement, so that they could cite that proof of residence to to evade the eviction order or the impending demolition which would follow. So Nathuram, through some negotiation with the local municipal officer, agrees to get ration cards issued for various members of the slum dwelling. Now, ration card are of different categories. You have a yellow ration card, a red ration card, and a white ration card. Red ration card is the one allotted to the BPL families, below poverty line families. Yellow is also for vulnerable groups, but it offers ration at a less subsidized rate as compared to the BPLs. And then white is the normal ration card, which is issued to everyone who's not perceived as a vulnerable community, vulnerable category. Now, he negotiates with the municipal officer, and as a result, many members of the slum dwelling are given the ration card. But all of them had hoped for a red ration card, which is a ration card which should have been the ration card of the members of the below poverty line families. But but all of them seem to have got either a yellow or a white ration card. And they think that it's a mistake with which they have been given a yellow or a white ration card. When Veena Das, during her field work, is examining the ration card, she observes that even though these little cards appeared exactly like a ration card, they replicated the ration card, they were not actually ration cards. There was a particular line clearly mentioned on the card. This is not recognized as a ration card. The line was written in Hindi which said, "ये राशन कार्ड के रूप में मान्य नहीं है." However, not being a ration card, it was still called a Pradhikar Patra. Pradhikar Patra, which means that it established a particular right. It was a Pradhikar Patra. Now, what is the conundrum here? On the one hand, it's not a ration card. On the other hand, it's a Pradhikar Patra, which means it is establishing a particular right. If it's not a ration card, it cannot establish your right to claim certain benefits from the state. Yet it is establishing that right for you to claim those benefits from the state. On the other hand, the expiry period was only 3 months written on the Pradhikar Patra. But people of the dwelling had continued to use it repeatedly years after years without anybody raising any objection on its use every time they went to claim benefits using the Pradhikar Patra. What does it mean? It means that while one looks at ration card as an authoritative text again, you have a replica of the ration card which replicates the concept of the authoritative text, yet is no longer an authoritative text. but it still establishes the right that the authoritative text in the doctrinal approach would intend to do. So, an empirical reading of the authoritative text, the third question through which one can look at law, the empirical question would say that the effect of the ration card would be these benefits to the bearer of the ration card. The replication of the ration card as a Pradhikar Patra minus the authority, minus the import of the idea of the authoritative text still establishes that particular right and manages to have the same effect. That means that it still allows people to have the same benefit as the ration card would. Now, this completely demolishes a doctrinal perspective alone of looking at an authoritative text. Because if a text which is not legal, which does not have the status of the authoritative text, is able to achieve the same effect through the authorization of the state, how does doctrinal law respond to it? And the answer is that the doctrinal law cannot respond to it because it refuses to acknowledge perspectives that are external to it. To understand this kind of a phenomena, one has to understand it from an external perspective, where state itself acquires an extra legal character, where state itself is authorizing documents that are extra legal, which are not legal, but they still claim to give the same benefits, establish the same legal rights because they have the authorization from the state. Why does the state do that? That's the welfare function that the state performs with all its intentions of, giving the required doles to the vulnerable community to maintain its constituency, so on and so forth. Those are arguments that we need not get into. We are interested in how this domain of the extra legality is created by the legal itself through the replication of the legal, where the authorization of the state allows the benefits to be claimed, benefits to be transacted, yet not being given the status of the authoritative text. And to understand these kinds of phenomena, the phenomena that we've discussed, the examples that we have discussed, one needs to look at those texts which claim a certain internal normativity, that claim autonomy from society, that claim autonomy from the context in which that they approach, that claim to be understood only through an internal perspective. We need to deconstruct these characteristics associated with the authoritative texts and thereafter demolish the claim of objectivity that these texts claim to represent. What do we achieve through this? In the stories itself, it is pretty clear that there are different consequences of problematizing the idea of authoritative text. We have taken examples of those texts where it facilitates the struggle for rights. There can be, like I'd said in between, there can be so many examples where it actually facilitates the imperatives of the state and actually allows for state to also acquire a more repressive character by going beyond the legal mandate, where state is able to act extra legally towards the detriment of the people. All of that is also possible. But to do so, one needs to take away this idea of sacredness attached to documents that appear to be objective and situate them in the context in which they work. The law and social science movement, the movement from where I have derived most of the lessons for today's discussion. In America, this movement was called the Law and Society movement, and it's something that the 20th century, the latter half of the 20th century, has seen. is something that needs to be credited with this particular approach. Now, a word about that particular movement before we close the discussion. The movement was termed as law and society, or law and social science, as it came to be understood in many of the third world countries, including India. The use of the word and to separate law from society was perplexing to people because, as social scientists, we do not necessarily look at law as an outside phenomena. We look at law as part of the society. So, if it is commonsensical to us that law is part of the society, why not call it law in society, and why instead call it law and society? And the answer to this particular question is something that we have actually found in the discussion today. Despite the fact that law is a social phenomena, law is a social fact, and it is embedded in the society, hence it is a part of the society, law is still a separate category from the society. And when you affix them with the word and not in, you are still granting certain kind of semi autonomous or relatively autonomous existence to the two, which is necessary. Because law is not like any other element of the society. Law is also that element of the society which has the capacity to govern the society, which has the capacity to order the society. So, law in that sense is relatively autonomous of the society. But to establish the relative autonomy of of law as complete autonomy, as completely internal to law and totally external to the society, does disservice to the understanding of law, as we have seen. So, if we have to understand the relationship between the two, we need to understand it as being related through the word and not necessarily in. Law exists as part of the society, but it's still relatively autonomous. It has a certain existence which is conditioned by the society. On the other hand, society also gets conditioned by law. So there is a relationship of mutual constitution between the two. And the pedagogic lesson for us is, how do we establish this idea of relative autonomy at the same time mutual constitution of law and society when we look at those documents, those texts, those figures, those symbols in which law speaks to us? And when law speaks to us, it's also the state speaking to us through law. In order to understand that communication, we need to have a deconstructed idea of the relationship between law and society, which what the social science can be credited for to have created. Thank you.